Welcome to today's lunch hour lecture. My name is Patricia Rothman. I'm a member of the Lunch Hour Lecture Committee, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Sophie Scott. Sophie is Deputy Director of the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience. She's the group leader of the Speech Communication Group. Her first degree was at the Poly of Central London, and her PhD from University College. She's now a Wellcome Fellow here, and very welcome. Among her interests are the neurobiology of speech perception, the evolution of speech, and profiles of recovery in aphasia. She was interviewed last week by Jim Al-Khalili for Life Scientific on the radio, and she likes doing stand-up comedy. Sophie.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about the science of laughter, and I just want to start very briefly by considering what laughter is, what we talk about, what we mean when we talk about laughter. And also what I'm going to do is panic slightly because my first slide isn't coming up. So while that doesn't happen, what we mean by laughter is basically spasmodic movements of the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm. So that's not normally how we characterize laughter. You sort of think about laughter as being, a funny noise that we make, but we literally make laughter by producing very strong contractions of these muscles between our ribs. So that's why people start bending over when they laugh. The intercostal muscles, which are the muscles between the ribs, which you normally use for breathing in and out, and then when they do that, they move like this. You get this sort of sinusoidal movement for what you're all hopefully doing now, which is staying alive by breathing. What's really interesting about the intercostal muscles is we use them very differently when we're speaking, and only humans can do this because we walk upright and we've freed up our rib cages from having to support our weight. So when we talk, you actually use the rib cage in a very different way, and you're using it then to squeeze air very slowly out, a very controlled way out from the larynx. And if I keep speaking without taking another breath, you can actually hear that my intercostal muscles are having to squeeze air out and keep you maintaining constant pressure here. Then I have to take another breath. So this thing, actually, you have as much fine control over these intercostal muscles as you do over your hands. It's an unbelievably complex motor act that you're doing. And that's what you're using to make a sound here at your larynx. You're just like sort of blowing into a musical instrument. You're maintaining a constant pressure here, and that helps you make the sound. Now, what happens when you laugh? Just look at the size of the movements here. That's breathing. That's the same movements, but for speaking. This is what happens when you start laughing. So you get unbelievably rapid spasming, and the deflections are massive. This is one of the reasons why it feels good to laugh. You are literally exercising your rib cage. You get the same increased uptake of naturally circulating endorphins after laughing that you do after exercising, because you've literally done a lot of work. And it's why it becomes physically painful after a while to laugh. And what it does, it gives you the very characteristic sounds of laughter. It gives you those sort of bursts, ha, 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 ha. The other thing that it does is, because you start to create enormously high pressures, much higher than you would normally create when you're speaking, you start to get very characteristic, strange sounds creeping in. So when somebody's really helplessly laughing, you can see properties of their voice that you really couldn't actually produce in any other way. And the next slide that I have is an example of somebody trying to speak through this. It's Charlotte Green, who used to be a newsreader on the Today programme. And you'll hear somebody down the line who has to say a slightly hilarious name. And then if you listen really carefully, somebody whispers the hilarious name to Charlotte Green, and they know what they're doing, because this makes Charlotte Green start to laugh. But I want you to look at the bottom, because at the bottom, you're seeing what's happening to the pitch of her voice, and see what happens to the pitch of her voice as she's starting to laugh, as this behaviour is starting to occur. So this is the pitch of her voice down here. This is the other speaker.
Singer Rock's unpopular replacement has now been dismissed, with the Army's popular Chief of Staff, Jack Twat, taking over.
A 40-foot sperm whale, which was stranded in the Firth of Forth for more than 4 days, is now thought to be swimming towards open waters again. It freed itself late last night. Marine experts are hoping to establish this morning whether the whale is finally back at sea.
Good luck to the whale. 8:10 is the time. An investigation is...
There's a lot to love about that clip. I really like the way the guy down the line goes, Jack Twat, nothing to see here. And then somebody else goes... at Charlotte Green. And it's that interaction, she's not on her own, and it sets her off laughing. And I really like, you can actually see the development of the laughter overwhelming her motor system. And this is one of the really interesting things about laughter. It's coming along and it's taking speech, which is something we've evolved to do and evolved to do with great skill, and it's just stopping you being able to do it. It's as if you stop being able to use your hands to do something complex when you get in an emotional state. It's quite extraordinary. And you can see what it's doing to her voice. She also carries on making noises after she wants to. So you get these little sort of involuntary sounds that she can't not make. It's being forced out of her. It's an unknown question. We don't know how this happens. We don't know why laughter overwhelms the system this way. We don't know why you carry on making a laugh long after you actually want to make any noises because, for example, you're broadcasting live to the nation. So there's a whole other set. I'm not going to give you an answer to that. It's just an interesting question that I'd like to know more about. The interesting thing about laughter, when we started looking at it a few years ago, because we were interested in emotional vocalizations, things that people do when they're in particular emotional states, and sort of words aren't enough. So when you probably, if you were really frightened, the other morning I thought a mouse had run over my foot, and I screamed. I didn't say, I'm frightened. I made a loud vocalization, even as I thought, that was a hair grip, Sophie. I know that wasn't a mouse. So, these things just start getting emitted from you. And they're very interesting because they're a lot more like animal calls than they are like speech, and they seem to be under a very different sort of neural control. They are just evolutionarily more ancient. And we got interested in this, and we got interested in looking in positive as well as negative sounds, because most of the work's been done with faces, and most of it's looked at negative emotions. So we started looking at things like laughter and relief, because we were interested in sort of the positive as well as negative vocalizations. And as part of this, my PhD student, Disa Sota and Frank Eisner from my lab, did several trips out to Namibia, because one of the things we were interested in was it's fine to study our own culture, but which of these emotions can we see actually being cross-culturally recognized? And what we found was, of the positive emotions, only laughter was recognized by everybody. So the English recognized the Himba in northern Namibia, laughing, and they know what it means. The Himba recognized English laughter. And that starts to suggest that what you're dealing with here is an universal emotion which is seen across all humans. Just to give you an example of that, this is a chap who's been asked to produce a particular emotion, and you'll see what happens to him. So what he's actually producing there, the emotion he's coming up with a sound for, is triumph. And the scenario we gave the Himba, because it's hard to think of things that work cross-culturally, was you've caught and killed a cheetah. And there's about 10 minutes of him going, what? The international language of, huh? Me? What? And then he's producing a triumph sound. Now, you play that sound to people in Britain and they don't know what it means. Likewise, if you play a Himba recordings of us going, woohoo, they don't know what that means. At the end of making that sound, you can hear off-site other people are laughing at him, and he starts to laugh. And then it becomes completely recognizable. There's no ambiguity at all. So it really does seem that we're all laughing in the same language. You might expect this to be the case when you widen out your search a bit, because, of course, human beings are not the only animals that laugh. Laughter has been described in chimpanzees, in orangutans, in gorillas, and even in rats. So Jan Panksepp, there's a rat up on the top left there being tickled. Apparently the best place to tickle the rat is the nape of the neck. They've gone for the controversial stomach move there. The nape's the best. And what they found was that rats make this sound when they play, and they wondered, is it laughter? So they started tickling the rats, and then they found that the rats make that same sound when they're trying to elicit tickling from you. They'll kind of curl around your hand making the noise. And if the same person tickles the same rat every day, they'll make that sound when they see you coming into the lab, which sounds like your day's really been made because there's a rat very happy to see you. The thing that's really striking is that the origins of laughter itself is the same. If you're a human baby, or if you are a rat baby, or if you're a chimpanzee baby, laughter first emerges in interaction. And it first emerges particularly for tickling. In fact, that's possibly the only reason why tickling exists, is sort of to get laughter off the ground. And what you find, and of course tickling, it has to be an interaction, and you see this being part of laughter all the way across the lifespan. So if you ask adult humans what makes you laugh, they will talk about humour, and they will talk about comedy, and of course those are situations in which we laugh. However, we laugh most of all when we're with other people. You are 30 times more likely to laugh if you're with somebody else than if you're on your own. And you will laugh more if you like those people, and you will laugh more if you want them to like you. It's a social behaviour, and we're using it to indicate amusement, but also affection, love, affiliation. That's what you're doing with laughter. And that's the same if you're a human or a rat or a chimpanzee. It's a very old mammal way of sort of making and reinforcing social bonds. And it's behaviour that you can potentiate and prime. So what we know from the rat literature is that rats who laugh more when they're tickled as adults are the rats who are tickled more abundantly when they were infants. So although we know that deaf and blind babies will still laugh, they've never seen or heard anybody laugh, but they will produce laughter, we know that you can encourage that behaviour. So it's actually something that you can learn to do. And we do learn to do. We spend a lot of our lifetime, childhood particularly, learning to laugh. So laughter is completely associated with play in childhood, and all mammals play. There's a particular face associated with play, so that's the sort of loose, happy play face. You can sort of see it's quite hard to get photographs of adults doing it because they tend to tighten up into a smile. You can see it's exactly the same in a chimpanzee as in my brother. I'm not drawing any particular meaningful comparisons there, just that that's something you can note. Play is so important to dogs. They even have a formal sign at the start. So when dogs do this, it means everything after this is a game. We are now playing. Playing is really important to mammals, and laughter is a big part of that. It's so important to us that, in fact, when we were doing a study a few years ago looking at what happens in the brain when you listen to emotional vocalizations, what we found when people heard emotional sounds, and these are things like ugh, as well as laughs and cheers, we got activation in auditory areas because these are very complex auditory stimuli, but we also got activation in brain areas that you would use to control movement of your face and your voice, to make a sound and move your face into a smile, for example. And this was interesting. This sort of pattern of what are called mirror areas involved both in the perception and the production of something. There's been a lot of interest in these, and this seemed to suggest that part of what happens when you encounter an emotional stimulus is you partly maybe understand that by starting to produce it a little bit yourself. But the really interesting thing was it wasn't the same for all the stimuli. So the effects were much, much greater for laughter than for disgust. Now, disgust is an extremely emotionally contagious emotion. If I start going, ugh, there's absolutely, without guarantee, I will shortly start to feel sick, and you probably will all start to feel sick, but you probably won't all start going, ugh, as well. With laughter, you have the emotional contagion, but you also have behavioural contagion. We are primed to join in. And I think that's what we're actually seeing here. Even though these people are having their brain scanned, they're just listening to sounds. Having your brain scanned, as I know those people in the room can attest, is quite boring and uninteresting. Nonetheless, even in this situation, when you're hearing somebody laugh, you're getting ready to join in with that laughter. And we were really interested in this because it seemed to be maybe a neural basis for this contagion. And you see the same phenomenon for other contagious behaviours. So you get a very similar profile for yawning, which is, again, a very, very contagious behaviour. So maybe you're really sort of seeing the brain basis for this kind of getting ready to join in sort of behaviour. But that turned out not to be the whole story. And we got interested in sort of thinking about laughter a bit more. And one of the things about laughter is that people like doing it. Now, bearing in mind, I've worked a lot with emotional vocalizations, and historically, I've sent papers off to review or I've given talks. And one of the responses I very often get from people is they say, these stimuli are posed. They're not really, people aren't experiencing those emotions. And my response is always the same. I say, yeah, that's true, but then that's true of all the literature in sort of on emotion. What would it ethically mean if I was to take somebody and put them in an anechoic chamber and make them so disgusted that they make a noise? What would that take? What would that mean? There's good reasons why we don't generally do this, or make them so angry or so frightened or anything like that. But of course, you can do it with laughter. And there is a history of this in terms of looking at information, because people have done it with smiles. So here I've got two smiles, and here it's actually shown on the face of Paul Ekman, the guy who first described a lot of this stuff on emotion. I want you just to have a look at these two smiling faces and tell me which of these two smiles looks nicer. The one on this side. Okay. The mouths are actually exactly the same. So if I just black out the eyes, it's the same photograph. What's different is that the eyes are different. Now, there's the whole literature on this kind of what makes a real smile, and one of the arguments is that in a real smile, what you get is movements not just of the mouth, but of the eyes and the muscles around the eyes. And that a kind of indicator of a genuine smile is a lot more movement around the eyes. Now, I've seen America's Next Top Model, and I know for a fact that Tyra Banks can do something like 28 different smizes where she smiles just with her eyes and not with her mouth. So I question the extent to which there's a complete lack of voluntary control over the eye muscles. But nonetheless, you can pick up differences. And people are good at it. You can look at a photograph and know, is that person really smiling or not? And I can certainly think of prominent politicians who are very prone to kind of lots of laughter and smiling behaviour around people. And you look, it's not really hitting the eyes. You know, it's a more sort of deliberate voluntary behaviour. So we thought, well, let's go in and do this with laughter. What happens with laughter? And it's also the case that people have done, and psychologists, we like to categorise things, and there's a lot of interest in kind of coming up with lists of different sorts of laughs. And I thought, well, maybe it's not to do with different sorts of laughs, and it's more to do with, are you laughing in an involuntary way, or are you laughing in a voluntary way? So that kind of helpless laughter that Charlotte Green was emitting, is that different from somebody choosing to laugh? And of course, there's lots of situations where we do choose to laugh. We will laugh politely a lot of the time. So, you know, and then you can imagine that would have there would be different neural systems involved in this. And we know from the monkey literature that chimpanzees had two different laughs. So they laugh differently when they're being tickled than when they're trying to make play last longer. So there's a good reason to suspect these might be different in humans. So what we did was we just set out and did whatever it took to make each other laugh in the anechoic chamber. If you've ever been in an anechoic chamber, it's quite a claustrophobic experience, so it's hard to make people laugh. It's not the naturally sort of joyful place you might imagine. What we did is we found lots of things that work. We got people to think about YouTube videos that they liked. We got people to come along with friends where possible. So we had like groups of people. Remember, people laugh more when they're with other people and they laugh more when they're with their friends. This is an example of the sort of clips people use. This is just very brief. Just to say Schadenfreude. That turns out to be big. Schadenfreude is big.
Early next week. The council also said it would continue to clear pavements, but it's warned that water supplies are now at critically low levels.
It's still dangerous for Dublin pedestrians. The City Council has brought in private operators.
So there was a lot more than that. It wasn't all people falling over. So what we ended up with was sets of laughs where, we got the same people to produce social laughter. So we got them to not to produce like ha, ha, ha laughter, but sort of like nice, friendly, warm laughter, but you are definitely choosing to laugh. So we end up with sounds like this. So here we've got, I want you to listen, think if you see this sounds like a real laugh or a posed laugh. Posed. Real. Here's another one. This one actually turned out to be considered to be, we have good data on this. This is considered to be the most contagious laughter by everybody that we've tested. Hang on. Does that sound real or posed? Sounds real. It's real. Yeah. So we end up with these sets of stimuli, and we've done a few different things with these. So one of the things that we've done is we've done an acoustic analysis of the difference between real and posed laughter. And as you might imagine, remember, you're creating incredibly strong forces when you laugh really helplessly. What you find is that there are differences. So in real helpless laughter, genuine, authentic, involuntary laughter, you start to get much higher pitches created. And in fact, very often they are quieter than the posed laughs because you start getting that kind of like thing going on. What you find in contrast is that the posed laughs have other sorts of things associated with them. So a lot of the posed laughter is quite nasal, for example. So you get kind of sounds that you actually physically couldn't make if you were laughing helplessly. And there's a lot more to know about this. And as I said, it's literally his early days. But there's clearly big differences between these two different sorts of laughs. And people are good at hearing them because we know what they mean. We've also had the opportunity to test a very large data set, do an online experiment with the Royal Society just to look at large groups of people listening to these sounds. And it was those same 10 sounds I just showed you. And we just asked two different questions. We asked people for each laugh to decide if it's real or posed. And we also asked them how contagious it was. And this is the posed laughter. And here at the top you've got the ratings for the real laughs. And here you've got the ratings for the posed laughs. And that's age range. And if you look, children start out not being particularly good at telling them apart, and then people get better and better and better with age, with the real laughs. They don't get better and then plateau out at puberty. They don't get better and then plateau out when the brain's sort of fully developed in the early 20s. People continue improving at this until they're in their early 30s. That looks like social learning. You are continuing to learn about laughter and what laughter means into your early adult life. We also asked people how contagious the laughter is, and this is slightly more depressing. Everybody's finding everything less funny, particularly for the pose laughter. That's tailing off pretty good. So the kids are just like, yay, it's all hilarious, because we're 7 and everything's hilarious. And it's tipping down a bit. For the pose laughter, so for the real laughter, it goes down less strongly. But maybe, simply as you know more about laughter, it takes more for you to feel like laughing than just, I hear laughter. You want more than that, but you probably need other people around you, for example. There's a peak here that we don't really understand coming in when people are between 40 and 50. So either people's midlife crises are really hilarious and we've not understood enough about that, or there's something else going on. Maybe the menopause is hilarious. Maybe there's just lots of hilarious things that we've been instructing as negative. Who knows? And we took these stimuli into the brain scan and we just played people laughs, real and posed laughs. We didn't tell them what they were going to hear. We didn't tell them it was a study about laughter. We put other sounds in there so that they weren't sort of misled, but they weren't realising they were in a laughter study. And what we did with this was simply ask them afterwards, what did those sounds sound like? So we just have data like from them listening without responding to these sounds. And what you find is even though people weren't being told to do anything with real and posed laughter or decided there was real or posed laughter in there, they didn't even know there was real and posed laughter there, people's brains are still telling the difference. And what you find is there's more auditory activation for the real laughter, presumably because it contains all these sounds you don't normally hear. And there's lots more what's called mentalizing activation for the posed laughter. So what you're seeing is brain areas you'd normally see associated with overtly trying to work out what somebody else is thinking are activated when you hear somebody laughing and they're clearly not actually helplessly laughing. You're trying to work out why they're laughing. I think it's that an important social signal that your default position is to try and work out what's going on. And if that person isn't laughing helplessly, you want to know why. This is the mirror activation that I talked about before from the previous study. Those output systems that are activated when you hear laughter. Interestingly, it doesn't care about the difference at all. So these output systems, these sort of priming systems, are equally activated by hearing real laughter and posed laughter. However, when we took people afterwards, we gave them a test whether or not they could, just how good they were at telling real from posed laughter. What we found was, for any one subject, the more that they recruited these systems when they were just listening passively, the better they were at telling the difference. In other words, it's not just contagion. Getting ready to join in when you hear laughter seems to be actually helping you understand what that laughter means. It's like a social intelligence. So laughter's being described as the shortest distance between two people. And I like this quote because it's kind of getting at that idea that laughter is it's an intimate social behaviour and we're using it to make and establish social bonds. So when I laugh with someone, we're showing that we have all sorts of aspects of our relationship in common and we're kind of sharing this moment. But I think it's more than that. I think it's actually something we actively go out and are ready to do. So I just want to finish with the last clip of some people. This is a clip from YouTube of some young men in East Germany making a very macho film. I apologise, there are underpants, and I've edited out the swearing. Okay, no swearing. You see if you can spot my edit. But just look what happens to them. They're trying to make a film of real daring do.
Willst du noch eine Rede halten?
Hand hoch. Alles klar. Das kann ich mir gleich geben, ich ziehe mich da gleich sofort raus.
Warte, ich filme das Wasser, warte.
Eis.
Eis hier überall. Ja,
egal, überall. Go wrong with this.
In der Mitte am besten da.
Ja. Ich will nicht mal gucken, nicht nachher das zu haben. Ist nicht drauf?
Ja.
His friends are already laughing.
Oh my gosh. Oh, ich muss
Double that with caring laughter. He's not laughing. He is now. Literally can't stand up. No one can stand up. So I think there's more than that. I think one of the things we mean by friendship, one of the things we mean by affection and love are the people that we're with, that we're actually ready to drop into this with almost any moment. You're using the laughter actively to close those distances. So I'd just like to finish, because we've got plenty of time for questions, by thanking all of my collaborators on this. It takes a village to raise a child, and indeed probably more than that to do studies on laughter, and all the fantastic people who've come in to help us actually record laughter. Thanks very much.
Any questions? One here. Yes?
Don't they need the microphone, I
There
think?
should be a mic.
Oh, cool, cool.
There should be one. Fine. Down here.
I think it's remarkable. You've given a wonderful talk on laughter and how universal it is without talking about what's funny and how universal that is. So have you found that the same things are funny across cultures and across other people?
I very deliberately don't talk about humour because there's a diplomatic and a non-diplomatic answer. I've never been convinced by any psychological investigation into humour. Sorry, Freud, that includes you. It's always a little bit icky. And I think it's like trying to say, why do people like different books? Why? Because there aren't universals in humour. They get themes and fashions, but things change so quickly. And I think, but it's probably easier to study laughter separate from humour because you can ask, I think, sensible scientific questions about laughter because you'll find that is the same, whereas the actual content of humour can be enormously variable over time, over location, over groups of people within those locations. So it's much, much harder. And I think it's the same as trying to say, why do people like certain sorts of music? Are there musical universals? And once you get beyond certain things to do with the structure of music, it tends to collapse quite quickly. And I think that's probably the same with humour. I think it's a much harder question to address and possibly not one that it's feasible to address with a psychological perspective. Sorry for people who have.
Any other questions? Yes, one over here.
Thanks ever so much for that. That was smashing. When you laugh, when you're laughing uncontrollably, it is probably, well, maybe the best feeling you ever have, being out of control with laughter. And two things I wanted to ask about that. One is there any connection with the release of endorphins when that's going on? And the other is, why is it enhanced when we're trying to stop ourselves? The more we try and stop ourselves laughing, so it actually starts to hurt, the nicer the feeling is.
Your point's extremely well made, and it is exactly true. So you get a great uptake of endorphins when you're laughing. And so these are the body's natural painkillers. And you can actually measure this. Even posed laughter, sort of going, ha, 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 raises your pain threshold. So you imagine what genuine, helpless laughter does. And it's doing so because of this mechanism. The uptake of endorphins is increasing your tolerance for pain because it's literally a painkiller. And that seems to be coming about because of the amount of physical work that you're doing. When you laugh hard, you're doing an enormous amount of work. And that's shown by, you can't use your upper body to sort of be upright after a while. And it hurts. And that's showing exactly how, it's like taking your legs for a sprint. That's what laughing is for your ribcage. I've forgotten your second question. The second question was about stopping.
When you're trying to stop yourself, it enhances it.
I think that's because one of the problems is it's a behaviour that's primed, and you can actually see that on the recording of Charlotte Green. She's not laughing at first. She starts to laugh more and more and more. And more. It's sort of increasing, and almost certainly along a sort of physiological route as you're getting a greater and greater recruitment to the systems involved. I think if you try and stop that by thinking about what you're doing, you enhance it because you're still thinking about laughing. So I suspect that it might be, if you could think about something totally not to do with what's actually happening to you, then that might be the route to go down. So perhaps if a tiger came running in the room, you might stop. Something else sort of took your attention. But I think it's also a very interesting question because as far as I can see, this is where the parallels with other animals break down. What I haven't seen any evidence for is other animals getting helpless with laughter. Because if a tiger came in, it could eat them. So we get into a state where we are not in a, we couldn't look after ourselves, to put it nicely, which evolution doesn't commonly do. There aren't many places where that happens, and it happens for a reason. So I suspect that it may be because we just freed up all this stuff to speak, where inadvertently it can get overwhelmed by laughter. We just don't know at the moment.
We have a question down here.
Yeah, you spoke about some of the effects associated with laughter, be it false or genuine. Now, there used to be a politician, a well-known politician called Edward Heath. Anyone as old as I am will remember that, who was renowned for shaking his shoulders when he laughed. Was that a manifestation of genuine or fake laughter?
It's hard to say because people are quite good. We sort of have a good knowledge of what that entails. You get that shaking because you've got this real big movement of the body, and of course your shoulder girdle is at the top there, so you're not laughing by moving your shoulders, but it's getting moved because of this movement of the rib cage. I mean, it's why you can tell if somebody sitting in front of you, say in a really inappropriate situation, has started to laugh because of those sort of body movements. I think you could probably use it cleverly if you wanted it to look like you were really helplessly laughing and not making a sound. It's a good cue to give people. No, it's almost certainly wasn't. That's just me being biased about Edward Heath, but hey, topical comedy there. She's going down strongly against Edward Heath.
Another question down here.
Did you look at the connection between weeping and laughing?
Oh, no, very good question. We are actually looking at that now because crying and laughing are extremely similar in terms of how you make them. So it's mostly to do with ribcage movements. And of course, they're the first two things that you can produce in terms of ways of making a noise. Babies can cry pretty soon after they're born, and then they start laughing about 2 months later. And those are the two main ways of actually making noise and communicative sort of signs. And so, and I think that's why they're made in a similar way, because that's where babies first get motor control, is sort of this area, because that's how you start breathing. And then it lets you make a sound by sort of just treating all this stuff as a squeeze box and kind of stamping on it to make sound coming out. So to laugh and to cry, you don't need to do anything sophisticated here or here. The complexity's all coming in here. So I think that's why they're linked. I think they're also interesting in that they are both have this kind of overwhelming quality. So once you've started crying, and I can tell you, we've now, after having all our hilarious fun making each other laugh in the anechoic chamber, we've been making each other cry, and it's awful. It's awful. And you feel rotten, and you can't stop, and it's dreadful. In fact, the only way we can stop people crying is getting them laughing. Hello, but it sort of has that. If I get disgusted and I make a noise, I'm unlikely to run around making that noise for very long. And laughter and crying don't have that property. They've got much longer sort of motor acts associated with them, and we just don't know why. But that's one of the things we are trying to find out about, because as you say, they are extremely closely linked in a number of different ways.
A question on this side.
I found the kind of empathy that you described, where you hear somebody laughing and you kind of want to join in, really interesting. But what about when people are laughing at you? What happens to the brain then?
Well, it's a very good question. I was on Ipswich railway station about 1.5 years ago with my partner and our son leaving Felixstowe, and there were a load of leery teenagers on the train from Felixstowe. And as we got off at Ipswich, I felt a tap on my shoulder, and I looked up, and there was all this laughter because they were actually on this side of me. Hilarious men of Felixstowe. And it was awful. At that exact point, if they'd all fallen under a train with their hats and their trainers, I would have been all right. I could have briefly coped with the tragedy in which they suffered. Because they were laughing at me. No, I didn't have any illusions. I hadn't seen them on the train and thought maybe we'll all be friends one day. And I hadn't gone to the railway station to meet men. None of this was on the agenda. So I was in a good place that we were two separate social groups until that was marked by them laughing at me. And then with that laughter, they made it absolutely clear that this was not shared with me. And that was really interesting because the laughter was positive and it was doing all its jobs inside the group. It was doing exactly what it's doing for them, but it was awful because it was not at me. So I think there's a huge contextual element. And imagine if I'd gone through that situation and at the end of it thought, they want to be my friend. We're all friends now because we're all laughing. That would have been even worse, wouldn't it? So that kind of social understanding, as reflected by how we use and interpret laughter, I think is really, really, really important. We're extremely alert to that. What the developmental course of it is, I don't know, and it's something else we'd like to know about, but I suspect you would interpret the exact same laughter totally differently if somebody told you it was laughter directed at you.
Another question down here.
Why do we laugh when we have the unpleasant experience of being tickled?
I think that we actually only can be tickled to get laughter going because nobody's ever come up with a good reason why we're ticklish. I mean, there's certain parts of the body that, on humans, so it's kind of down the sides and on the feet, and people have actually made the argument that they're particularly dangerous bits of the body that you need to preserve. You know, they're really, what, like, unlike the windpipe or the abdomen? I mean, you know, I can think of the body, parts of the body which are more at risk from harm than, you know, the armpit. So I think it's possibly that they're safe. They're sort of safe in a number of levels. So, you know, no one's going to think you're doing something terrible to a child if you're touching their armpits. They've kind of like evolved to be safely tickleable bits. And the tickling just exists to get laughter going. Because as you say, it's not, I mean, most people find it actually highly aversive. There was a factoid saying people stopped being ticklish by the time they were 40, but that seems to be a factoid. I can't actually find any scientific basis for this, but it's certainly something that maybe its whole purpose may simply be to get laughter going, and then once you've got the laughter going, you can encourage it, and you can see it evolve into other situations. So the important thing for laughter isn't that you stay ticklish. The important thing for laughter is that you start using it to play and to make contacts and learn about things when you're playing, I suspect.
Another question here.
What is the efficacy of laughter as a therapeutic tool, whether a therapy to create laughter or hearing laughter?
There's a lot of interest in laughter in terms of laughter yoga. Is that the kind of, so I suspect in laughter yoga what you're finding is you're getting to all the same things that people like about laughter. You know, it feels good and you get this pain relief and it's relaxing and bonding. But it's just a different route to it. So it's kind of framed as a healthy exercise. So, you know, it's simply a different route into, I think, basically the exact same outcome. So I think you could probably feel as good after laughing with friends or going and seeing stand-up comedy that made you laugh as you would do after laughter yoga. But they're just three things that some people might find it a more appealing idea than, you know, something else. I suspect that's it. And I think the health benefits are largely to do with the sort of this sort of increase in uptake in endorphins. You get a high from laughing that is the same as an exercise high because it is an exercise high. It's just a different sort of exercise high.
There's a question over here.
I was wondering about the sort of link between laughter and survival and evolution, and actually some of the comments sort of linked up to that, and whether it's a good way of actually incapacitating your opponent.
Possibly, yeah. And it's certainly, people are very good at using laughter cleverly. So my brother worked as a journalist for many years, and a business journalist. He had a female colleague who was brilliant at getting stories. He said she's better than me. And what she's doing is she's laughing when the people are talking to her. She's really good at using laughter. And the men and the women who were talking to her wanted to hear more of the laughter. They would tell her more to get more of this lovely, rewarding laughter. There was, you know, kind of all feeling great. So I think it's, you know, probably a number of different levels. As I say, it's not just something we sit around waiting to emit. We're kind of using it in a number of very clever ways. And I'm sure if there's an example out there of a sword fight ending up one person laughing helplessly, I mean, you might imagine context might modulate that. But certainly, and it's interesting that you can use it socially to get what you want, I think. And that's a very, you know, and you'll get what you want in a situation where people will be happy to give it to you, you know.
Any other questions? Yes, over here.
Hi, I was just wondering whether you had done any research into what types of people are more likely to be the types to laugh along, and whether there's any individual personality characteristics that you know who's more at risk of this or that.
Well, it's something we're trying to look at now, because there was a hint of it there in that brain study. There was variation in how much people were getting primed by the laughter. And the people who were primed more were the people who were better at telling the difference between real and posed laughter. So what does that mean in the other direction? Every time I give this talk in some online situation, somebody will say to me, well, not just online, but generally, somebody will say, I never laugh. I find things funny and I never laugh. So what is that? What does that mean? And what knock-on effects does it have on your interactions? There's really lovely work from the US by a guy who kind of gets couples in and he wires them up onto a polygraph, and then he gives them a stressful thing to talk about. And it's like, it really is. He kind of, so it's all very heteronormative, but he'll say to the man, you know, tell me something that irritates you about your wife. They've kind of got to talk. They're not at gunpoint. They could leave, I guess, but you know, the social norm is that they're going to do what they're asked to do. So they have to talk about something stressful, and you can see physiologically they start to get stressed. And the couples who manage that stress with what they call positive affect, but what is laughter, not only you can see the stress get sort of on top of, they are the people who stay together for longer. If you take duration of relationship as a marker of success, then that's, you know, a good thing. But I think I'd really like to know more about that, because it does suggest that we, as I say, we're using it very cleverly to improve not just our mood, but actually how we're getting on with the people that we care about. We're not just laughing together. We are using it we're using it in a very sophisticated, nuanced way to actually make life easier, to make life more comfortable, to make life happier.
Well, that's a wonderful note to finish on. I'm afraid it has to finish there, but I think you'd all like to join me in thanking Sophie for a wonderful lecture.